Betrayal is a wound that cuts deeper than words can express. When a husband discovers his wife's infidelity with an old classmate, he doesn't confront her outright. Instead, he crafts a masterful plan, a reunion that becomes the ultimate stage for exposing secrets. What begins as a nostalgic gathering spirals into a tense psychological game, leaving his wife and her lover trapped with no way out. In this gripping tale of betrayal, revenge, and unspoken truths, nothing is as it seems, and no one escapes unscathed. Will justice prevail, or will revenge destroy what little remains?
It started innocently enough. At least that's what I told myself. The small changes in her demeanor, the way her laughter seemed forced, or how her gaze flicked away too quickly when I spoke. I didn't want to overthink it. But doubt has a way of worming into the most secure corners of a man's mind. One evening, as I reached for her phone to check the time, her hand darted out, faster than I'd ever seen her move, to snatch it away. "Just a work thing," she said, her voice tinged with a nervous chuckle. It was the first time in years I'd seen her flustered, and that moment stayed with me like a splinter. Weeks passed, and I tried to dismiss the feeling, but other signs emerged. Her late-night phone calls, muted laughter behind closed doors, and an unfamiliar name popping up in casual conversations. Just an old friend from school. That name started to echo in my head. The tipping point came one Sunday morning. I was pouring coffee when I noticed her looking at her phone, lips curved in a smile I hadn't seen in years. Not directed at me, though. That smile was reserved for someone else. Curiosity got the better of me, and I did something I never thought I'd do. When she stepped away, I opened her laptop. There, in her messages, was the truth I'd been avoiding. Innocent words, yes, but their frequency and tone betrayed a deeper connection. That name, his name, was everywhere. And just like that, the world I thought I knew shifted. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed time to think. But in those quiet moments, I began to plan. The first time I saw his face, it was in an old class photo she'd shown me years ago. I remembered him vaguely. A lanky figure standing in the back row, barely noticeable among the sea of grinning faces. But now, his presence loomed large, like a shadow cast over everything we'd built together. After finding their messages, I couldn't resist the urge to dig deeper. Late at night, when she was asleep, I scrolled through their exchanges, each line tightening the knot in my chest. Their words were laced with nostalgia, inside jokes I didn't understand, and veiled sentiments that left little to the imagination. There was one message that hit me the hardest. "I miss this version of you," he had written, followed by her response. "It feels good to be myself again." Those words burned. Was I the reason she felt caged? Had I somehow become the enemy in the story she told herself? I tracked his social media, piecing together fragments of his life. A successful man, divorced, no kids. It made sense why she might feel drawn to him. He represented a version of her past she'd never quite let go of. And the realization was like swallowing glass. But I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. That would make it real, and I wasn't ready for the chaos that would follow. Instead, I focused on him. I imagined his smug smile, the satisfaction he must have felt knowing he was pulling her away from me. That anger became the fuel I needed to keep going. I spent nights staring at the ceiling, planning my next move. I didn't want to lash out blindly. No, this needed to be precise, deliberate. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he'd done, and I wanted her to see it too. The days after my discovery felt like walking through a storm. The kind where the rain stings and the wind howls so loudly you can't hear your own thoughts. I'd sit across from her at the dinner table, watching her laugh at some banal show on TV, and I'd wonder how she could seem so normal. Did she know I knew? Did she care? I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together. Not in explicit detail, my mind wasn't that cruel, but in the way they must have looked at each other, the way she used to look at me. It was the loss of something intangible, something I hadn't realized I'd already begun mourning. There were moments I wanted to scream, to shout her name and demand answers. But the words would catch in my throat, replaced by a gnawing doubt. What if she lied? What if she told me I was imagining things, that I was the crazy one? No. If I confronted her, I needed proof that would leave her speechless. Yet, beneath the anger and betrayal, a quieter emotion began to creep in. Shame. Had I been blind to this? Had I let our marriage slip into such a dull rhythm that she felt the need to seek excitement elsewhere? These questions clawed at me, but I had no answers. The worst part was pretending everything was fine. I played my part, a dutiful husband who kissed her goodbye in the mornings and asked about her day in the evenings. Inside, though, I was unraveling, my mind racing with possibilities. But even in the chaos, a seed of resolve began to grow. I realized I didn't just want her to feel regret. I wanted her to see me, truly see me for the man I still was. And I wanted him to feel the weight of his actions, to understand that taking what doesn't belong to you comes with consequences. The idea came to me in the dead of night, somewhere between anger and exhaustion. I was scrolling through social media, mindlessly flipping through memories of people I hadn't thought of in years when a photo stopped me cold. It was from an old class reunion, her class. There he was, standing among a group of smiling faces, his arm casually slung around someone else's shoulder. That's when it hit me, a reunion. Not an official one, no. This one would be mine to control. I'd stage a gathering so carefully orchestrated that they'd have no choice but to walk right into it. If she and her friend wanted to revel in the past, I'd make sure the past was waiting for them. The next morning, I began reaching out to her old classmates. Social media made it easy. It's been so long. I wrote, feigning enthusiasm I didn't feel. Wouldn't it be great to catch up? The responses poured in, some eager, some indifferent, but all intrigued enough to show up. I spared no detail. The location, the food, the atmosphere, it all had to be perfect. Nostalgic but polished, a setting that would lull them into a false sense of comfort. The kind of place where secrets feel safe. And then there was the guest list. I ensured his name was on it, slipping it in casually when I spoke to her. Oh, and I invited your old classmate. What was his name again? He seemed excited to come. She hesitated for a moment, her face betraying a flicker of something. Panic, maybe. But she recovered quickly. That'll be nice, she said, her voice steady. I couldn't stop smiling after that. Not because I was happy, no, far from it, but because I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. This wasn't just about confronting them. It was about crafting an experience, a moment they'd never forget. And as I finalized the details, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. The pieces were falling into place. The invitations went out the following week, each one carefully worded to stir curiosity and nostalgia. A night to reconnect, I wrote, to celebrate the bonds of the past and the memories we all share. It sounded warm, innocent, even exactly what I needed it to be. Her reaction when she saw the invite was predictable. She looked at me over the top of her coffee mug, a hint of surprise in her eyes. "You're organizing this?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. "Why not?" I replied, feigning nonchalance. "I thought it'd be fun to see where everyone's ended up. Besides, you always talk about how much you love high school." She nodded slowly, but there was something in her expression, an unease she couldn't quite hide. She didn't argue, though. How could she? On the surface, I was doing something thoughtful, something she had no reason to refuse. As the RSVPs rolled in, I tracked each response meticulously. His reply came late, but when it did, it was exactly what I'd expected. A simple, looking forward to it. Those 3 words felt like a challenge, as though he were daring me to see this through. The closer the date got, the more the tension between us grew. She started asking more questions. Who was coming, what kind of food I'd ordered, whether it was formal or casual. I answered her patiently, keeping my tone light, even as I watched the worry flicker behind her eyes. What she didn't know was that every detail of this event was designed with her and him in mind. The seating arrangements, the timing of the speeches, even the music. It was all a stage, and they were the unwitting stars of my carefully plotted show. By the time the evening arrived, the air between us was thick with unspoken words. She seemed nervous as she got ready, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her dress. I caught her reflection in the mirror and forced a smile. "You look beautiful," I said, my voice calm and steady. She smiled back, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Neither of us said what we were really thinking, but we both knew this night would be one to remember. The venue buzzed with chatter and laughter, a symphony of nostalgia as people reconnected over old stories and shared memories. It was perfect. Warm lighting bathed the room, and the scent of freshly prepared appetizers mingled with the faint hum of familiar music from their teenage years. It was a carefully curated illusion of comfort. I stood by the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand, greeting familiar faces with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. The room was full of animated conversations, yet my focus was pinned to one corner, her corner. She arrived before him, looking radiant in a way that made my chest tighten. Her laughter was easy at first, her smile genuine. She worked the room like she belonged there, and for a moment, I questioned everything. Could I have been wrong? Was I about to destroy something I'd misunderstood? And then he walked in. His entrance was understated, casual. But when their eyes met, it was as if the entire room fell away. Her smile softened. Her body language shifted, just enough for me to notice. They exchanged pleasantries in front of the group, but I caught the subtle glances, the undercurrent of something more. I bided my time, mingling with guests and weaving light-hearted conversations. But every so often, my gaze would drift back to them. Watching her, watching him, I felt the anger simmering beneath my skin, tempered only by the anticipation of what was to come. When it was time for dinner, I guided the crowd to their tables, ensuring she and her bold friend were seated just a few chairs apart. It wasn't enough to make them suspicious, but close enough to keep their interactions in my line of sight. The night unfolded as I had planned, with toasts and stories that had everyone leaning into the past. She looked so comfortable, so at ease, until I tapped my glass and called for everyone's attention. "This has been a wonderful night," I began, my voice steady but carrying just enough weight to silence the room. "And since we're all here to reminisce, I thought we could play a little game. A way to uncover those stories we haven't shared yet." The murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. She looked at me, her eyes narrowing just slightly. That flicker of unease was back, and it sent a thrill through me. The room buzzed with curiosity as I explained the rules. "It's simple," I said, holding up a small stack of index cards. "Each card has a question, something to help us dig up the stories we never thought we'd tell. We'll go around the table, and everyone answers honestly. No skipping, no excuses." Laughter broke out across the table, but I saw the tension settle on her face. She glanced at him, just for a second, but it was enough. They both knew this game wasn't as harmless as it seemed. I began with light questions, ones that made people laugh or blush with embarrassment. "What's the most ridiculous thing you ever did in high school? Who had the worst taste in music?" The group was relaxed, caught up in the fun, their guards slowly coming down. But as the game progressed, the questions shifted. "What's a secret you've kept for years? What's something you regret but would never admit to?" Each card brought a deeper hush to the table, the kind of silence that amplifies every word spoken. I watched her closely, noting the way her hands clenched her napkin when it wasn't her turn. And when the card asking for the biggest lie you've ever told landed in front of her, I thought I saw her flinch. She glanced at me, her smile strained, and offered a vague answer about skipping a test in high school. It was clever, safe, but it wouldn't save her. Finally, I drew the card I've been waiting for. "What's one thing you've done that you hope no one ever finds out?" The energy in the room shifted. The laughter faded, replaced by an uneasy tension. I handed the card to the person on my left, and the answers started rolling in, some trivial, others tinged with discomfort. And then it was his turn. He hesitated, his fingers drumming against the edge of the table. "I guess I once borrowed a friend's car without telling them," he said with a weak chuckle, his voice lacking conviction. It was her turn next. She looked at the card like it was a bomb waiting to go off. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The silence stretched, and every eye in the room was on her. I don't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't think of anything." I leaned forward, my expression calm, but my voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Come on, honey. Everyone has something." She froze, and in that moment, I saw the cracks begin to form. The silence that followed her hesitation was heavy, like the pause before a storm. She looked around the table, her eyes pleading for someone to change the subject, to laugh, to save her. But no one spoke. I leaned back in my chair, feigning nonchalance. "If it's too difficult, I suppose you could pass," I said, letting the words hang in the air just long enough. Although it's usually the most interesting secrets that are the hardest to share. Her face flushed, and she forced a tight smile. "I'll pass," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "Fair enough," I said, nodding. Then I turned my attention to him. "What about you? Any secrets you've kept from old friends?" He stiffened, caught off guard by the directness of my question. "I already answered," he said, trying to laugh it off, but there was no humor in his voice. "All right," I replied. "The borrowed car. Such a harmless little tale. But it makes me wonder, what other stories are hiding behind those polite smiles?" The tension in the room was palpable now. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their laughter and chatter replaced by uneasy glances. She reached out, placing a hand on my arm. "Let's not ruin the night," she said softly, her tone pleading. But I wasn't done. "Not yet. Ruin the night?" I repeated, turning to her. "I thought this was about honesty. Isn't that what we agreed when we started this game? No skipping, no excuses." Her eyes widened, and I saw the fear creeping in. He shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. The dynamic had shifted completely. They weren't just cornered, they were exposed. I let the silence stretch for a moment longer before I leaned forward, addressing the table. "You know, the funny thing about reunions is that they remind us of the past. Who we were, who we've become." My gaze flicked between the two of them. "And sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us." Her hand trembled as it clutched her glass. He looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't dare. And in that charged moment, I knew the trap had sprung. The table fell silent, the weight of my words sinking in like a stone in deep water. The mood had shifted entirely, the lighthearted nostalgia replaced with an almost suffocating tension. My gaze stayed fixed on the two of them, and for the first time all night, neither of them could meet my eyes. "Since we're sharing tonight," I said, my voice measured, "I think it's only fair that I contribute too. After all, honesty is the theme, isn't it?" She looked at me then, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. I could almost hear her thoughts, begging me to stop, but I pressed on. "Here's a little story for the group," I began, my tone casual, as if I were recounting a harmless anecdote. "It's about a man who thought he had everything, a good life, a loving wife, a future he could trust. But one day, he discovers that his wife has been spending a lot of time reminiscing with an old friend. The air in the room seemed to thin. She shifted in her seat, her face pale. He straightened his posture, his discomfort palpable. And this friend," I continued, letting the words come slowly, deliberately, "wasn't just catching up. No, he was rewriting history, crossing lines. Lines that, to this man, were sacred." I paused, letting the impact of my words settle. Around the table, the guests looked uneasy, unsure of whether they were witnessing a moment of raw truth or some elaborate performance. "But here's the twist," I said, leaning forward. "This man, he didn't lose his temper. He didn't confront them outright. Instead, he waited, he planned, and he invited them to a little reunion, just like this one, so they could face the truth together." Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the table. The sound jolted everyone, but no one spoke. He stared at me, his face drained of color. "And now," I said, my voice cold, "the floor is yours. Perhaps the two of you would like to share your side of the story." She looked at him, then back at me, her lips trembling as she struggled to find words. The room felt like it was holding its breath, every eye on them, waiting for their response. The silence stretched on, thick and unbearable. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice cracking. He shifted uncomfortably, looking around the room as if searching for an escape. "This is ridiculous," he said, attempting to laugh, but it came out strained. "I think you've had too much to drink." Their denials didn't matter. The truth was written all over their faces, in the way her hands shook as she reached for a napkin to mop up the spilled wine, in the way his eyes darted to the door. I didn't say another word. I didn't need to. The damage was done. The guests murmured among themselves, their curiosity and discomfort palpable. I let them fill in the blanks, let their imaginations run wild with what I might have discovered, what they might be hiding. She looked at me then, her eyes brimming with tears. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing chatter. I leaned in, keeping my tone low but firm. "Why? Because you thought I wouldn't notice. Because you thought you could lie to me, to all of us, and get away with it." I stood then, addressing the table with a polite but final tone. "Thank you all for coming. It's been an enlightening evening. I think we'll call it a night." One by one, the guests began to leave, their curious glances lingering on her and him as they shuffled toward the door. The whispers were unavoidable now, the rumors already spreading. By the time the last guest had gone, the room was empty but for the three of us. She turned to me, tears streaming down her face. "We need to talk," she pleaded. "Not tonight," I said, my voice flat. I looked at him, my expression unflinching. "And you can see yourself out." He hesitated, as if he wanted to argue, but one look at me was enough to send him toward the exit. When the door finally closed behind him, the house fell into an eerie quiet. She stood there, sobbing quietly, but I didn't move to comfort her. Instead, I walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. Revenge wasn't sweet. It wasn't satisfying. It was bitter, hollow, like ashes in my mouth. But it was necessary.
Keep watching our stories by clicking on one of the videos that appear on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be alerted about new videos. See you next time.